Hello everyone, this is Philipp Jonas for Kalamazoo Valley Community College, and in this lecture we're going to discuss monopoly. So this is our second lecture on applying the fundamental rules of business from an economic decision-making standpoint. We started in the last lecture with perfect competition, and now we're going all the way to the opposite extreme. Monopoly, one firm that serves the entire market. So before we get to the decision making here, we have to discuss why this happens in the first place. Why don't additional competitors enter the market, especially since monopolies tend to be highly profitable? The answer is that monopolies enjoy a barrier to entry, something that prevents new competition from entering. In general, barriers to entry can be categorized into three major types. The first two are very straightforward. Number one, resource monopolies. Some products require a so-called key resource to produce. A key resource cannot be substituted away from. So if such a key resource exists, it is possible for one company to monopolize ownership of it. And that makes it the only company that can now produce the product. This is very rare in practice. In economics, we often like to use the De Beers Mining Company as an example, but even that example isn't perfect because while they own many of the world's diamond mines, it's not all of them. And there's also the increasing question of how synthetic diamonds might make diamond mines less necessary. Secondly, there are legal monopolies, literal laws that prohibit competition. Now, obviously we wouldn't want to do that in general. Competition is good for our society, but we do give time-limited legal monopolies quite frequently in the area of intellectual property rights. The two big examples here would be patents and copyrights. While discussing intellectual property is a little beyond the scope of this course, quick reminder, patents are usually granted on inventions, think the better mousetrap, while copyright typically applies to creative expressions, think books, movies, music. Companies enjoy a temporary monopoly on those as a reward for the creation before the intellectual property passes into the public domain and can be freely copied. Now let's talk about the third barrier to entry, the one I think is most interesting: natural monopoly. Some markets, by their nature, collapse into monopolies even if there aren't artificial restraints like a key resource or a law. That happens when the cost structure of a market makes it so that one firm can more cheaply produce the entire output of the market than if it were split among many firms. Let me give you an example. Let's say there's 1,000 homes that need electricity. Yes, electric monopolies have many other reasons as well, but let's focus on the cost structure here. To deliver electricity, you need an electric network. Those are expensive to build and maintain. A big fixed cost. But if you have an electric network, hooking up an additional home to it is relatively cheap. So this is an example of a market where if we were to graph average total cost across how many homes are being served, we would get a curve that always decreases. Not U-shaped, always decreases. That's because the more homes you serve, the more you can spread out that huge fixed cost. And secondly, the low marginal cost means that it'll be below average total cost and keep decreasing it. So what's going on here? Well, one firm that serves the entire market, so all 1,000 homes, by definition will be at the lowest average total cost. Any firm that serves less than the whole market, let's say we split that firm into two, will have higher cost. So if we split this monopoly up, first of all, we should ask ourselves if that's desirable since cost will go up. But even if we decide that it's desirable, it won't be stable. Sooner or later, one of those firms will eke out a small advantage, have a few more customers, that places it lower on the average total cost curve, And then it becomes a snowball effect where they will be more and more competitive until they are the sole provider again. Natural monopoly is the reason that we will always have to deal with the problem of monopoly in economics, because some markets simply have a cost structure that works this way. So now let's talk about how monopolies behave. The most important distinction between a perfectly competitive firm and a monopoly lies in the demand curve they face. So the demand curve of an entire market obviously is downward sloping. But as we learned in the last lecture, the individual demand curve that a competitive firm faces is not. It's horizontal. This is called being a price taker. No matter how much you sell, you do not affect the price for your product. Now, a consequence of being a price taker is the following. For perfectly competitive firms, since they can sell more without lowering price, each unit sells at the same price. Price and marginal revenue are the same number, the same curve. This is not going to be the case for monopoly. So let me explain this in a few different ways. First of all, the monopoly, by definition, faces the entire market demand curve. And that one is, of course, downward sloping. So what this means is, if a monopoly chooses to sell more product, it will have to lower price. Now, at first, that almost sounds like it's bad for the monopoly, but as we'll discover, it gives them the ability to do the opposite. Hold back on production so that they can maintain higher prices. Most importantly, if you have a downward sloping demand curve, price is no longer equal to marginal revenue. Selling an additional unit will not raise your revenue by the price of that unit, because selling that additional unit reduces the price on all the other units you're selling. This can be a little tricky to understand when you first hear it. So let me show you in a couple of different ways what this looks like. Let's start out with a hypothetical example. You've got a coffee shop that for some reason has a monopoly in the town. Nobody else can sell coffee. And your coffee shop faces a market demand curve. Depending on the price of coffee, here's how many customers you have every hour. So this is different from perfect competition. If you were operating a perfectly competitive company, you'd have no choice about the price you charge for coffee. So now, let's do some calculations. Let's start out by calculating the total revenue of this firm, followed by its average revenue, and finally its marginal revenue. Go ahead and pause the video if you would like to do this by yourself first. Alright, so let's have a look at what the answers here amount to. Total revenue, that's price times quantity. And already when we look at the total revenue of our coffee shop, we notice something that would not happen to a perfectly competitive firm. There is a range of output where selling more coffee actually reduces the revenue of this coffee shop. I'm not talking about profit. This is not about cost. I'm saying it'll actually have the customers giving less money to the shop if it sells them more cups of coffee. What's going on there? Price. While a monopoly can choose what price to charge, it is still limited by the demand of its product. So for example, if I want to sell 5 cups of coffee, the most I can charge is $2. If I were to charge more than $2, I wouldn't be able to sell 5 cups of coffee. So each of these prices on the demand of the product reflects the maximum that our customers are willing to pay, depending on how many customers we're trying to serve. So look what happens here when we go from 5 to 6 customers. If we want to have 5 customers, we can charge each of them $2. That's $10 in our cash register. But if we want to serve 6 customers, that's only going to happen if we lower price to $1.50. And while that means, yes, we've got that additional 6th customer giving us $1.50, it means we're getting 50 cents less from the 5 other ones. That means net, that's lower revenue. 6 times $1.50, that's $9. I'll reference this mechanic a few more ways. Now let's look at it from an average and marginal basis as well. Average revenue, like all averages, is calculated as total revenue divided by quantity. As we've learned in past lectures, average revenue is equal to the price of a product. Not different for monopoly. What is different for monopoly is marginal revenue. Marginal revenue is the change in revenue divided by the change in quantity. And what we notice here is that revenue increases slower and slower as we increase production and eventually even starts decreasing. So that's different from competition. For a perfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue equals price. For monopoly, marginal revenue is less than price. This will lead to different behavior. Let me show you the same phenomenon graphically. Here's the demand curve of our coffee shop. So I'm graphing price and quantity here. If this is what the demand curve for an individual business looks like, you already know you're not looking at perfect competition. In perfect competition, individual businesses face a horizontal demand curve. And now, along with this demand curve, let me graph the numbers for marginal revenue. See, it's not the same as the demand curve, as it would be for a perfect competitor. Instead, for monopoly, marginal revenue is below the demand curve, and, if you're curious, it also always ends up with twice the slope of the demand curve, so it looks steeper as well. Let me discuss this in terms of terminology as well. When a monopolist decides to increase production, it has two impacts on the revenue of that monopoly. Number one, more production means you're selling more units. This raises revenue. We call it the output effect. But increasing production also forces you to lower price. This decreases revenue. We call this the price effect. So you can think of a monopolist's marginal revenue as these two effects pushing against each other. Increased production brings you more unit sales, but less price per unit. It's even possible, as with the example of the coffee shop, that the price effect dominates the output effect. When the coffee shop increased production from 5 to 6 units, it lowered price by 6 times 50 cents, but it increased output by only 1 additional unit. So in summary, monopolists have marginal revenue that's less than price. Now let's get to profit maximization. We learned the basic rule for profit maximization in our last lecture. You choose the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This is no different for monopoly. So identify this intersection right here, MR equals MC. That's your profit maximizing quantity. But then there's a second step. In perfect competition, you are a price taker, so you don't have the ability to choose your price. A monopoly is a price maker, so they can now choose which price to charge for this quantity. How does the monopoly do that? Well, it's pretty straightforward. It will charge the maximum price it can. Think back to our coffee shop example. Depending on what quantity I want to produce, I can look at my demand to see the price I want to charge. The same is true here on the graph. Once I've identified my profit maximizing quantity, for this quantity, I now look on my demand curve, here it is, for the price I can charge. So you want to be a little careful the first couple of times you do this yourself. You identify quantity using the intersection of MR and MC, but don't go straight over to the y-axis for price. At that quantity, you have to go all the way up to the demand curve, and that's the maximum price you can charge. We'll do this a few more times in this lecture. So here's a monopoly that has its profit maximized. let's finish up what we've already learned about profit maximizing behavior. If I were to now also give you the average total cost of this monopoly, we could go ahead and calculate its profit. This works the same as for perfect competition. At the profit maximizing quantity, identify the price and identify the average total cost. Again, at the profit maximizing quantity. You will now have a rectangle whose height is price minus average total cost. That's profit per unit. And whose width is the number of units produced. This is the profit of the monopoly. Now, with perfect competition, we were also looking at companies that are earning a loss, but that would be a little unusual if you have a monopoly on a profitable market. So in some sense, this concludes the business perspective on the monopoly. Having a monopoly allows you to charge higher prices, you will earn a profit, and because you have a barrier to entry, other competitors won't take that profit away. But what about the social perspective? After all, economics is a social science. Well, we've got a lot more to talk about there. Because while having a monopoly is great for the business, it is not good from a social standpoint. Let's explore why. Let's start out with a basic description of prices and quantities that happen with a monopoly versus perfect competition. Now, in perfect competition, if I want to find the price and quantity in a market, I look at the model of supply and demand. I cannot do that when looking at a monopoly, because as odd as this sounds at first, a monopoly does not have a supply curve. Let me explain. Here's what a supply curve is. If you have a competitive firm, it is a price taker. And then depending on what that price is, you can construct a line that tells you what quantity it will want to produce. In fact, in the last lecture we learned this line will be the marginal cost of that competitive firm, assuming it doesn't want to shut down or exit. But what about the monopoly? We just maximized the profit of that monopoly. And did it take price as given? No, it was a price maker. We first identified the profit maximizing quantity and then determined the price to charge. So from a more mathematical standpoint, the price and quantity of a monopoly are determined by the demand for the product, the marginal revenue you derive from that, and its marginal cost. So for example, if the cost of a monopoly change, it will change its price as a result. A competitive firm does not have that luxury. That means we cannot draw one simple curve that is a reaction of any given price and determines the quantity of the monopoly. Instead, we will have to compare what we've learned from supply and demand for competitive firms with the individual profit maximizing behavior of a monopoly. The good news is, you can do all of that using just one graph and combining some of the things we've already learned. So let's do this. And we're going to start out with a simple example before we lay on some additional difficulties. Here is an example that's really great for understanding monopoly versus competition. Pharmaceutical drugs. When they are first developed, they enjoy patent protection. So literally a legal monopoly. Nobody else is allowed to make and sell them. But then comes the day where the patent expires, and now generic drug makers can produce the same drug. And I mean the same drug. They have to show that it's the same drug in order to not also have to do that expensive clinical testing. So look at this graph. Here is the demand curve, the marginal revenue, and the marginal cost of a monopoly selling this drug. For this first example, I'm also going to have the marginal cost curve be flat, be constant. We'll get back to that later on, why that makes the analysis a little bit easier. So let's do profit maximization. A monopoly maximizes profit by choosing quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then you go up to the demand curve to identify the price of the product. So here is profit maximization. if a monopoly is selling this drug. Now here's the comparison I want to draw. The price and quantity that the monopoly charges. What would the price and quantity be if this market was served by perfect competition instead? Well, in order to answer that question, you have to know one principle of perfect competition. In perfect competition, price falls to marginal cost. Price falls to marginal cost. So we can look at this graph and say, if this demand curve ends up being served by perfectly competitive firms with this marginal cost curve, what will price be at the intersection? Price falls to marginal cost. So here's our first observation. Compared to perfect competition, a monopoly charges higher prices. PM is greater than PC. And compared to perfect competition, a monopoly produces less quantity than competition. This isn't the complete welfare analysis yet, but it gives you a hint in the right direction. What's going to be better for our society here? Low prices and lots of quantity, or high prices and low quantity? The answer is, of course, competition is going to be much better. Let's look at that in even greater detail and do an actual welfare analysis. We've shown this semester already that perfect competition maximizes total surplus. This happens because in the competitive market equilibrium, price falls to marginal cost. But is that going to happen in monopoly? Not only did it not happen in our specific examples, it won't ever happen because of a simple inequality. A monopoly produces where MR equals MC. But a monopoly has MR less than price. That means price will not be equal to MC, it'll be greater to MC. In other words, the monopoly will fail to produce some units even though the willingness to pay of those who would buy those units, the maximum price they're willing to pay, is more than the cost of production. There's going to be a deadweight loss there. The monopoly quantity will be too low. If you want to, you can draw a comparison here to our analysis of taxes and how they lead to a quantity that's too low as well. It's quite comparable to what a monopoly does. Let's look at this one more time by using one graph to compare competition and monopoly. So here's another market. We've got a demand curve, we've got a marginal cost curve. How would this market be served by competition? Well, in competition, price falls to marginal cost. So at the intersection, we've got our competitive quantity. Going over to the y-axis, we've got our competitive price. And, as we've shown many times, total surplus will be maximized. So what about the monopoly? Will it charge that price and that quantity? Of course not. Let's go ahead and draw in the marginal revenue curve for monopoly serving this market. Below the demand curve and twice as steep. And now do profit maximization for the monopoly. Choose quantity, where MR equals MC. Go up to the demand curve to find price. Go up to the demand curve to find price. That means you're going to be at a higher point than marginal cost. Marginal cost is at this intersection. Then you go up to the demand curve to find price. That's the problem. Price doesn't fall to marginal cost. Or if you want to take a different perspective, the quantity is too low. At the competitive quantity, everybody gets the product whose willingness to pay, demand curve, exceeds cost of production, marginal cost. On a monopoly, not so. We'll have an entire group of people who, even though they value the product more than the cost of production, the monopoly will not serve. That means deadweight loss. As always, you can find deadweight loss in between the efficient quantity, the competitive quantity, and the distorted quantity. In this case, monopoly is the distortion. The first time we encountered deadweight loss, taxes were the distortion. The outcomes are pretty similar. So what do we do about this? Monopoly underproduces. Are there techniques we can employ to try to minimize that deadweight loss? Yes, but all of them have their own downsides. So monopoly continues to be a troubling issue in economics. Let's start with the first observation. Monopolies can have a lower or even no deadweight loss if they are able to price discriminate. Now, price discrimination, that's a pretty strong term. We're not talking about discrimination in the ordinary sense, which is a very bad thing. Price discrimination refers to the idea that you are charging different customers different prices. Once you're used to looking at this in the world, you'll notice it everywhere. Now, price discrimination becomes a very interesting topic you can study in courses on industrial organization. But we'll focus on the simplest type of price discrimination. Typically a business cannot achieve this, but if it could, it makes for a very clean-cut example. What if the business could assess what each customer is willing to pay? And then instead of charging one price across the board, it charges each customer that different price, their maximum willingness to pay. This will lead to higher profits and can eliminate deadweight loss. But there is a downside. Let me show you. So up until now, when it comes to monopoly, I've shown you a picture like this. This, for example, is from our example of generic versus on-patent pharmaceuticals. So if this is being sold by a monopoly, we identify the quantity at the intersection of MR and MC, go up to the demand curve to determine the price. Also recognize that horizontal marginal cost curve, constant marginal cost I was talking about earlier. It's going to make this example a little bit easier. So looking at this graph, let me identify three things: consumer surplus, producer surplus, aka profit, and deadweight loss. Consumer surplus is the easiest. It is above the price, below the demand curve. So here it is in green. Now producer surplus, we haven't got a supply curve, right? So we have to calculate profit. Profit is the distance between price and average cost times quantity. But let's not clutter this picture up too much. We'll make our life easy. Let's say the marginal cost is constant. Every unit has the same cost. And assuming further that there's no fixed cost, if every unit has the same cost, that marginal cost is also the average cost. We'll do that only for this example to make the comparison simpler. So if this is true, constant marginal cost, no fixed cost, then here's profit, aka producer surplus. Price minus cost per unit times quantity. And then finally, we just learned to identify the deadweight loss of a monopoly. In order to make sense of it, you have to identify the competitive quantity. That's where price equals marginal cost out here. Anything in between that competitive quantity and the monopoly quantity, in between demand and marginal cost, is deadweight loss. This monopoly is a monopoly that charges everybody the same price, a so-called single price monopoly. I didn't mention that, but that's what we've been doing in this entire lecture. Now, what about price discrimination? What if instead of charging everybody the same price, this monopoly can charge everybody a different price and it knows exactly what everybody is willing to pay? Now, it's going to be pretty rare in real life. But going back to the coffee shop example from earlier, imagine you could charge your sixth customer $1.50, but the fifth customer $2, and then going further up the line, you could even charge the customers $3 and $4 that are willing to pay more than you were charging them previously. What if you could charge each of them the maximum they're willing to pay. In that case, you'd be able to sell to every customer whose price willingness to pay exceeds marginal cost. You can sell to anybody that's willing to give you more money than the cost of the production of a cup of coffee. Or in yet other words, if we think about a monopoly as having an output effect and a price effect, when it sells more, the price effect goes away. You'd be able to sell additional units without lowering price across the board. What happens to profit in this case? If you can charge each person the maximum they're willing to pay, perfect price discrimination. For each customer, you would receive the difference between the price on the demand curve they're willing to pay and the cost of producing that unit. Price, cost, or in other words, the entire triangle below the demand curve and above marginal cost becomes monopoly profit. Notice the quantity is now all the way at the competitive quantity. So this outcome is, strictly speaking, efficient in the following sense. It maximizes total surplus. There's no deadweight loss. But it does introduce another type of imbalance. While total surplus is maximized, all of it goes to the monopolist. There is no more consumer surplus here. And that's the downside of perfect price discrimination. Now, leaving aside whether businesses can perfectly price discriminate to begin with, whether we should allow this, let us also notice that it, of course, is better for the business, and that while perfect price discrimination is difficult to implement, we see businesses using many examples of doing some price discriminations. Here are some examples that I enjoy. Probably my favorite example, movie tickets. There we are sitting in the same room watching the same movie. But when we go to the movie theater, does that big board show one price for all of us? No, there's like 4 or 5 prices up there. So what, for example, if you show up and you show a student ID? Well, if you're a student, as a business, I might suspect that your income is a little lower, and so your willingness to pay is lower. Lower price for you. If you show me that you're a senior citizen, again, possibly lower income, possibly lower willingness to pay, lower price. Or what if you're watching a movie on a Thursday at 2 in the afternoon? Maybe you haven't got a full-time job, lower price. But if you don't fall into these special categories, I'll charge you a higher price, the regular price, going to a movie on a Friday at 8 p.m. Where else do we see this? Airlines are a great example. Again, we all sit in the same airplane, get there at the same time. Now, first of all, obviously airlines price discriminate using the different classes, business class versus economy. But even outside of that, you can tell a lot about when people book their tickets. The more ahead of time somebody books a ticket, the more likely they are to be a tourist, probably paying their own way. The less time ahead, the more likely they are to be a business traveler on an expense account, maybe a little less price sensitive, higher price for them. Or whether they stay over the weekend contains a lot of information as well. Coupons are a great example of price discrimination. You're literally charging different people different prices depending on whether they went through the time and effort to clip the coupon. That's the secret to make clipping the coupon be a waste of time. The less valuable your time is, the more you are able to use it clipping coupons. This is especially visible now that we have electronic coupons on our smartphones. Why isn't there a button to just clip all coupons? Because the whole point is to make you root through it and only get the lower price if you're willing to spend your time. Of course, colleges engage in price discrimination as well. You're listening to the same lecture, but are you paying the same tuition? Well, it depends on how much financial aid you're receiving. Now, typically with colleges, we're looking at a non-profit situation. So the objective here is not necessarily to maximize profit, but to be able to use the above cost price that some students pay to allow other students to receive an education at a price that's below the cost of providing it. This is called cross-subsidization, when you're earning profit on one group of customers so that you can earn losses on another group of customers. We do this because we think it maximizes access to college. All right, that's price discrimination. What else do we have in our toolkit? Well, first of all, of course, if possible, competition is better than monopoly. So, if we can prevent monopolies, or maybe break up monopolies, that might be good. In the case of the United States, two big laws you want to be aware of there: the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act is the original one that prohibits outright collusion between businesses on prices and quantities, prevent them to act as if they were a monopoly. Then the Clayton Act is a big refinement that adds a list of specific behaviors that are also considered anti-competitive. For example, agreeing with a competitor on exclusive territories. Maybe one of you only sells west of the Mississippi, the other one only east of the Mississippi, giving you regional monopolies. Also a big no-no. The problem with antitrust laws is there's a limit to what they can achieve because some monopolies are natural. Breaking up a natural monopoly doesn't do much for you because the thing is just going to collapse into a monopoly again. So what else do we have? Sometimes we choose to regulate monopolies. Tell them to charge the price that the government sets to prevent those high monopoly prices. But again, lots of problems here. First of all, how efficient will the government be at choosing the correct low price? There are questions there already. But even if we pretend that the government has perfect knowledge, there's a real problem here. If we have a natural monopoly, marginal cost is going to be below average cost. So now we're in a dilemma. If we choose the efficient price, that's the one where price falls to marginal cost, this monopoly will now operate at a loss. Price will be equal to marginal cost, which is less than average cost. It'll require public subsidies. Or if we want the monopoly to break even, price equal to average cost, then we'll have a so-called second best outcome. It won't be fully efficient, that will be at price equals marginal cost, but hey, deadweight loss will be a lot smaller. So for some applications, this is a reasonable solution. Other times we look at the business and we decide that regulating it is actually more difficult or less efficient than simply having the government outright run that monopoly. So for example, it is very common for water and sewer systems in cities to be directly run by the government rather than provided by a regulated for-profit company. Again, problems exist. With public ownership, there can be a problem with cost control, because if there's no longer a profit motive, there isn't always a benefit to lowering cost. It's a trade-off. You have to look at every situation specifically and decide which approach to monopoly is going to give the best outcome. If we can make competition happen, yes, great. That's always a super one, but that's not realistic for natural monopolies. Maybe we'll be more effective at regulating a price. Maybe we'll be more effective at having the government run it directly. Or maybe, in specific situations, all of these solutions have such big downsides that for some monopolies, we decide to do nothing and let them exist as a monopoly with their associated downsides, because we decide any alternatives to that would have even greater downsides. This makes monopoly one of the most interesting industry types from a public policy standpoint. And that was our discussion on monopoly. I'll see you next time.